Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood straight up and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Well, I happen to be a fan of those optical illusions that go around on the internet. You know, is the dress blue or gold, those kinds of things. But there's one that I enjoy. It's actually 130 years old. And it's this one. It appeared in a German publication in like 1890 or around there, all right? And the question is, what do you see, a rabbit or a duck? How many of you see rabbit? How many of you saw duck? Okay, all right. And now what's interesting is, personally, I saw rabbit. It took me a while to see duck. What's interesting that I love is one of the sitcoms from a few years back that I really enjoyed was How I Met Your Mother. Okay, and they had an episode that featured this optical illusion, except they added a dimension to this, which was they then got into a huge argument about which is better, a rabbit or a duck. They were talking about seeing people and saying, oh, you know, sometimes you see rabbit, sometimes you see duck, and one person was presuming that rabbit was good and duck was bad. And the other person's like, "Are you kidding? Rabbit is gamey." And they start arguing over which is better. So those two questions are actually, I think, at the heart of our story today. This question of what do you see, and then is it better or not? All right? Because what happens in our story is that you have this woman appear, and she shows up in the synagogue where Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath. And it says that she has been crippled by this spirit for 18 years. She's bent over, quite unable to stand up straight. So it's obvious, right? Her infirmity is obvious, and she's been, coming over and over and over. Now, there's no way for us to know this other than the narrator informing us, because it's important to the story, that this has happened to her for 18 years. She probably is no stranger to this synagogue, right? So she shows up. It's clear that the infirmity is there. It's a very visible infirmity, that she can't stand up straight, and it's been here for 18 years. And the thing is, in this story, she says absolutely nothing, all right? She doesn't say a thing, all right? Often, Jesus would, go to a place and somebody who needed healing would shout out to Jesus, "Jesus, Son of David, I need your help." She says nothing. It simply says that Jesus saw her. Jesus saw her. She didn't ask. Everyone else, it appears, as far as you can tell from the story, everyone else is just ignoring her. She shows up, probably like she showed up every Sabbath, and she said nothing. And Jesus noticed her when everyone else was ignoring her. Jesus took the initiative with her, all right, which often, like I said, didn't happen. In so many other healing stories, it was often the person needing the healing. It was parents bringing their children to Jesus to be healed. It was friends bringing their infirm friend to be healed. It was all these things where other people took the initiative to bring the person. She just shows up in the synagogue and says nothing. And Jesus sees her, takes the initiative, because when she walked into the place, Jesus saw her need. Now, it's easy for us to simply say he noticed her because, well, he's God, okay? So he would know these things. But I also think that even at a human level, some of the things that made it easier for him to notice her are, first of all, he's new, right? He hasn't been here before. This isn't his synagogue. He's traveling around, and it's always easier for the person who's new to notice something, right? Okay? We don't notice things because it's familiar, right? It's so easy for things to be familiar. I mean, you see, in fact, I look around and I notice all these decorations for VBC, all right? You come in and go, wow, it's different. If we left these here for 6 months, all right, you wouldn't notice them anymore. You would just walk in and go, oh, that's the way it always looks. All right, it's really familiar. It's one of the things that we've learned about church AV stuff. Whenever as soon as you put screens in a space or speakers in a space, and people are like, what's that going to look like? Isn't that going to bother people? Isn't that going to be crazy? We're like, just all you do is install it and wait 3 weeks. All right. Week 1, half the people actually didn't notice it was there. Week 2, they notice it was there and complain about it. Week 3, it's just a part of the scenery. Okay? And that's just kind of the way it is. And so, Jesus is new. He sees her. He sees the need. And he responds to the need. But the synagogue leader sees something completely different. See, the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader didn't see her need. The synagogue leader sees a rules violation. All right? Now, is it just because he's hard-hearted? Is it just because he's not a good person? Is this the way you want to interpret the story? Or is it also partially the fact that he is conditioned as a leader of the synagogue to see the law, to see the rules, all right? That this is his conditioning, this is his role, this is where he derives his sense of importance, is through those things. So it might not just be, a hard-heartedness on his part. It may just be that he was conditioned by the role that he plays within the community, that what he saw was the rules violation. I mean, these things would happen all the time in churches. One of the classic things that happens in churches is crying babies. Okay? Is crying babies. Okay? All you need is one baby to start crying in a worship space, and you get to see people's conditioning very differently. Okay? Ushers see some noise that must be silenced. Okay? Because it is their job to maintain order in the worship space. So that is what they see. Okay? All right? Preachers see someone who's keeping people from hearing the sermon. All right? All right. Moms automatically empathize with the mom. Oh my gosh, the mom must be going crazy. The mom must be mortified right now because the kid is making noise. All right? You get all these different reactions that come from what you are conditioned to hear and see in the space. All right? So he was conditioned to see the law. He was conditioned to see the rules more than he was conditioned to see her. And he goes, look, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. I mean, his position isn't crazy. I mean, another piece of this is that she'd been putting up with this for 18 years. She'd been bent over for 18 years. All right? So the synagogue leader's thinking is, what's 18 years and a day? You've lived with this for 18 years. What's 18 years and a day? Why the rush? Why today? Why not come back tomorrow? The synagogue leader would have expected Jesus to basically say, to be the kind of person who would kind of do this by saying, you know what? Just for you, I'll stick around until tomorrow. See, to me, the synagogue leader's perfect response would have been to have Jesus compassionately say, instead of moving on to the next place because you need healing, I'll stick around here. Why don't you come back here tomorrow when it's not the Sabbath, and I'll heal you tomorrow? And everybody would have been happy. This would have been like the synagogue leader's solution to this, if you imagine what he would be thinking about. But here's the thing. When you have a situation like this that comes up to us so many times in life, there was a reason not to help. There was a reason to help. What would you see? Where would your heart be? Where would your brain go? What are you conditioned to see? Do you see reasons to do something, or do you see reasons not to, and what influences you? These are kind of important things for us to unpack in our lives. I mean, sometimes you find the person who always sees the reason not to do something is because they've been burned by it in the past. You see, the person who was bold and it paid off, it worked out well, they're the ones who see the reason to do something, all right? So you kind of have to unpack within yourself what influences you, what motivates you, what is deep inside you that makes you approach a situation, and where you see reasons not to help and reasons to help. What would you see? When you see a person out there in the world who needs help, what do you see? I know some people, they see someone who needs help and they see someone to sympathize for. Another person will see a potential grifter. And you can't say that they're right or wrong, but it is a matter of what is inside you, what motivates you. And often what motivates you is self-interest. I mean, Jesus comes right back to them. He says, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water?" See, the act of untying was work. They're not supposed to do that. He's like, don't you violate the Sabbath whenever your livestock needs water? You're okay with that. Right? Why do you care about your property more than you care about this woman? Which, by the way, is a big part of this culture. Literally, you might say that in that culture, there was a good chance that they did care more about their livestock than they cared about women. It was a deeply patriarchal culture. All right? And they probably were able to search through the scriptures and come up with rationalizations for why it was okay with God to take their livestock to water on the Sabbath. Because at the end of the day, self-interest and prejudices influence what we see. You know, sometimes we like to use that phrase, seeing is believing. The problem with that phrase, seeing is believing, is that we don't just see. We interpret what we see. And so we say seeing is believing, but because we interpret what we see enters our mind through the filters of our interpretation, and those filters often have self-interest in them. Those filters often have prejudice in them. The prejudices can lead us to see a threat where there isn't a threat. It can lead us to be empathetic in one case and disdainful in another. What we see is what we see, but our filters can be biased. Our filters can be filled with the sinfulness, filled with the things within us that are not supposed to be a part of us, and so we don't see what we should see, and their filters saw an ox or a donkey as more valuable than a woman who needs healing, and Jesus tries to recast what they see by referring to her differently. he refers to her as a daughter of Abraham. This is where Jesus is trying to flip what they see. You just saw a woman whom you don't value. What you should be seeing is a daughter of Abraham. This is what you should be seeing. This is how you should have noticed. You should have noticed this daughter of Abraham has been bound for 18 years. Why is it wrong to free her? Why is she not of greater value to you than your ox or your donkey? But you know what? In that time, women were a cost center. And so to say this actually upset the social order. This is actually a subtly subversive statement for Jesus to say, look at how important she is. You see yourselves as sons of Abraham. This is a daughter of Abraham. He's elevating her in a way that upsets the social order. And in doing that, he invites us to see the possibilities in a social order that doesn't perpetuate the prejudices and the injustices that exist. He's inviting us to create a better culture. See, one of the things that often constrains us when something new happens is because we react to it basically with a failure of imagination. Something new happens and we don't imagine how this could be better because it's different than what we'd experienced. Years ago I read this, and I love dropping it into sermons every once in a while, that I had read these books and things about storytelling and about screenwriting and that kind of thing, because that's actually been a factor in how people preach. They're actually, preaching in a way, in some senses, very much related to storytelling. So I've read books and stuff on this. And one thing I read, which was kind of interesting, is they said that when screenwriters get blocked, that they're going down a script, they're going down a pathway with their characters, and they just hit a wall. He said that one of the things that they're taught to do is to simply start asking, what if? And go crazy with it. They're like, what if? And this is how you actually get some of those wildly implausible situations in scripts, because they were invited to say, what if? They're like, okay, all right, so we've got our characters, and they've moved into a studio apartment in Manhattan. Now what? Well, like, one example they give us, like, what if they bought a horse? What if they bought, what if they bought a horse? And any of you who've lived in Manhattan, your first thought is it's easier to park the horse than a car. But what if? What if something crazy? What if something out of the ordinary? What if something we couldn't imagine? Just start throwing what ifs out there and see if something leads to something interesting. I think sometimes that when we get stuck as a society in places where we don't want to be, we don't ask what if enough. What if? What if we actually cared for our planet? What if we actually had an equitable society? What if we actually had better schools and more opportunity for people? What if we got away from the way we've always done things and started doing things differently? What if? And then what has to happen is that as soon as you put out that what if, you start getting the people where you find out they are in that argument. Which is better, the rabbit or the duck? Because as soon as you say, what if? You start hearing some people who are like, yeah, that would be awesome. Isn't this great? We need to work for that. And other people are like, well, can't you see what would go wrong? Can't you see what would be awful with that? Like, I like science fiction. I like Star Trek and stuff like that. And so, like, Star Trek is set in a future world where there was an episode of the Orville, which is Star Trek-like, and they were set in a future world where a person from a different society from the past goes forward, and in this future world that they envision, all their needs, technology has advanced to the point where everyone's needs are taken care of. So at this point, there's no need for money. All right, money is obsolete because they've got replicators. You want something, it makes it. And this person didn't understand. The person, is like, well, wait, if you don't have money or stuff, you mean everybody just does what they want to do? And the person says, yeah, everybody kind of has an intrinsic need to be valuable. And so they just find out where their giftedness is, and they contribute to society in that way without concern for pay. And this person is like, that can't work. How does that work? All right? And so I'm watching this episode, and I'm thinking, because I've heard that argument before when people have said, oh my gosh, if you give people money, they're going to stop working. And I'm like, okay, at one level that makes sense. At one level that resonates with me. And then again, in the church, I look at retired people. That now breaks down. Because every retired person I know looks for ways to contribute to society. Every retired person that I know, right, has a guaranteed income, right? They're on Social Security, they've got a pension, they've got their savings. So every retired person that I know actually is living on a guaranteed income. And as long as they are physically able, every retired person that I know tries to look for a way to contribute to society. All right. I actually can't think of a physically able, lazy, retired person. All right. I don't know any. I haven't seen a single one. They talk about being that way before they retire, and then when they retire, they aren't. So that makes me question whether my presumptions and whether societal presumptions are actually accurate. Am I seeing things the way they really are? Or am I just imagining the worst when it's not really true? Like when somebody comes up to you on the street and asks for money. What do you imagine? That they're going to spend it on food or booze? Both are possible. But what do you imagine? Do you go straight to the negative presumption about what you see? Or do you go straight to the positive presumption about what's possible? See, Jesus has always tried to steer us toward the positive, and it resonated with the people. When Jesus called out their hypocrisy about the ox and the donkey versus healing the woman, it says the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. The people knew what was better. The leaders didn't see the people. The leaders didn't see the possible. But I think so much of what Jesus was doing in his teaching was trying to show us ways to see the world differently. He would use all of these different metaphors when he talks about whether, God values a sparrow. Are you not of more value than they? The lilies of the field, don't worry about how they're clothed, and look how beautiful they are. All of these different things that Jesus taught about were different ways for him to try and get us to unlock our imaginations and see something different. He spoke of the kingdom in order to try and speak of the ways in which God intends society to work, which is different than what we think can work. It's an invitation from Jesus to see the kingdom in our everyday lives. He wasn't talking about the kingdom just to tell us a promise about what was to come. He wanted us to bring what was to come into the present. He wanted us to let that vision of what God intends not simply remain in the future, but to also let the future come into our present by changing the way we live now? Are you able to look at the possibilities around you and see kingdom values? Are you willing to see them even if they seem impractical to you? Are you willing to see people the way Jesus sees people? Because if you see things differently, you'll act differently. And what we see is filtered through our interpretations before we react to it. If we can adjust that filter to be more in line with God's thinking, to be more in line with what Jesus sees, then as the world filters through the Christ filter into our brains, we'll see things differently. And as we see them differently, we'll react differently. And as we react in accordance with the Christ filter on what we see, we will, in fact, make the world more Christ-like, which is what God intends for us. Not just in the future, not just to wait 18 years for healing, but to do it now. Amen.